The house had always been quiet at night, but that evening the silence felt engineered, deliberate, sharpened, waiting for him. Daniel Moore stood in the entryway with his coat still on, the key heavy in his hand as if it had gained weight since morning. The lights were on, all of them, an unusual brightness that flattened every familiar corner into something exposed and impersonal. The scent of Olivia's perfume lingered in the air, sweet and unfamiliar, layered with something else, another presence he didn't want to name. She was seated at the dining table, posture immaculate, hands folded as if rehearsed. Across from her sat a man Daniel recognized instantly, though they had never met. Mark Ellison, younger, polished, the kind of man whose confidence came from rooms that always opened for him. "We need to talk," Olivia said, her voice steady, almost relieved. Daniel didn't respond. He took in the scene instead, the untouched wine glasses, the chair pulled back slightly, the way Mark avoided his eyes. There was no chaos, no shouting, just order. That was what frightened him most. "I know," Daniel said finally. His voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "I already know." Olivia's expression tightened, not with guilt, but with impatience. "Then this will be easier." Mark stood, murmured something about waiting outside. Olivia nodded without looking at him. The door closed softly behind Mark, sealing Daniel alone with the woman he had married 13 years earlier. She gestured toward the couch. Daniel remained standing. "I want you to leave," she said. The words were precise, practiced. "For a few days?" Daniel asked, though he already understood. "No," Olivia replied. "For good." The room seemed to tilt, not violently, but enough to disorient. Daniel felt the weight of years press against his chest. Mortgage payments, quiet dinners, shared calendars, plans deferred and forgotten. "You cheated," he said, not accusingly, just stating fact. "And you're asking me to leave." "I'm choosing myself," Olivia said, for the first time in a long time. Daniel smiled faintly, a reflex born of habit. "And I was in the way." She didn't deny it. "You stopped being present," she continued. "You disappeared into routines. You made everything smaller." Daniel thought of the promotions he had declined, the calls he stopped returning, the name he had quietly removed from consideration years ago. He thought of how he had chosen stability over ambition, because Olivia once said she wanted a life that felt normal. "I made a life," he said, "with you." "And I outgrew it," Olivia replied. There it was. No remorse, no apology. She slid an envelope across the table. His name was printed neatly on the front. Inside were legal documents, separation papers already prepared, signatures waiting. "You planned this," Daniel said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Where do you want me to go?" "That's not my responsibility anymore." The cruelty wasn't loud. That made it worse. Daniel walked down the hallway past framed photographs, vacations, holidays, a life curated to look complete. He packed a single suitcase, clothes, a watch, a book he never finished reading. He left everything else behind, including the version of himself that had believed love was enough to erase imbalance. At the door, Olivia watched him without expression. "You don't have to do this like this," he said quietly. "I do," she replied. "I need a clean break." He stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a sound so final it felt judicial. The night air was cold. Daniel stood on the porch for a moment, staring at the door, half expecting it to open again. It didn't. As he walked down the driveway, suitcase dragging behind him, he understood something with sudden clarity. The betrayal wasn't the affair. It was the ease with which she erased him. Across town, Olivia returned to the table, poured herself a glass of wine, and told herself she felt free. She would spend years believing that. Daniel Moore vanished with a precision that surprised even himself. There was no dramatic departure, no farewell messages, no explanation offered to mutual friends who would eventually notice his absence. He did not correct assumptions. He did not defend his name. Silence became his only possession, and he guarded it fiercely. For weeks after the night he was expelled from the house, Daniel slept wherever anonymity was easiest, first in a modest motel off Route 9, Then in a short-term rental near the outskirts of the city where no one asked questions and no one lingered. He kept the television on at night, not for the noise, but to avoid the echo of his own thoughts. The disgrace followed him everywhere, invisible but heavy, settling into his posture, his voice, the way he avoided mirrors. Boston went on without noticing him. Each morning he woke early and walked. Through neighborhoods where couples jogged together, through streets where cafes opened their doors with practiced optimism, through parks where children screamed with joy at nothing in particular. Daniel moved among them like a ghost present, but disconnected from the rhythm of belonging. He did not tell anyone what had happened. To say my wife cheated felt incomplete. To say she made me leave felt humiliating. The truth was more corrosive than either sentence could carry. He had been dismissed, replaced, deemed obsolete by the person for whom he had quietly dismantled his former life. At night, memories came uninvited. The apartment in D.C. he had once maintained, untouched and waiting for a career that never resumed. The calls from former colleagues who had stopped asking after a few unanswered attempts. The path he had stepped off because Olivia wanted a husband who was home, not powerful, not consumed by institutions that devoured men whole. Daniel had believed love could justify that choice. He was wrong. Still, rebuilding did not arrive with vengeance or grand resolve. It came slowly, almost reluctantly, through practical decisions made without optimism. He reactivated old credentials, reached out to one contact, just one, who still remembered him without pity, took consulting work under a smaller name, behind layers of bureaucracy where his past carried no narrative weight. He avoided public profiles, conferences, social media. If Olivia had erased him, he would remain erased. And yet competence has a way of announcing itself. Within a year, Daniel was working steadily, quietly embedded in complex legal structures that valued precision over personality. His mind, once dulled by routine domestic compromise, sharpened again. Not out of ambition, but necessity. Survival stripped away sentimentality. He never spoke Olivia's name. Meanwhile, Olivia Moore curated a different story. To her friends, Daniel had become a chapter that ended naturally, two people growing apart, different trajectories, no villain necessary. The affair with Mark Ellison was reframed as timing, connection, inevitability. She learned quickly which version of the truth earned sympathetic nods rather than discomfort, and Mark was attentive, visible, impressive. He took her to dinners where reservation lists mattered, introduced her as someone important, someone worth noticing. In photographs, she leaned into him with the confidence of a woman who believed she had chosen correctly. The house felt larger without Daniel, but Olivia filled it with motion renovations, new furniture, louder music. She replaced quiet with activity, reflection with momentum. She told herself this was growth. On social media, her life looked enviable. Professionally, she thrived. Her firm rewarded decisiveness, forward movement, the absence of doubt. Olivia excelled at those things. The narrative of a woman choosing herself played well in rooms where success was measured by detachment. Occasionally, something unsettled her. A silence at night when the house seemed to hold its breath. The absence of someone who noticed small changes, new sounds, altered routines. Mark did not ask those questions. He assumed Olivia would tell him what mattered. She mistook that for respect. Once, nearly a year after Daniel left, Olivia searched his name online. Nothing recent appeared. No updates, no photographs, no professional announcements. It was as if he had stepped out of the world entirely. The lack of information disturbed her more than anger would have. She closed the browser and told herself it was better that way. Daniel's disappearance became proof in her mind that she had made the right choice. If he were stronger, she told herself, he would have rebuilt loudly. She never considered that silence could be deliberate. Years passed like that, uneven, deceptive. Daniel's life stabilized into something leaner, quieter, but internally coherent. He rented a modest apartment with windows that faced west, where evening light lingered longer than expected. He cooked for himself, read again, learned the contours of solitude without romanticizing it. Sometimes, late at night, he allowed himself a single thought. I survived. Not triumph, survival. Olivia's world, by contrast, grew increasingly performative. Mark's attention began to shift subtly at first, then unmistakably. Success bred options. Olivia noticed the delay in his replies, the absence disguised as busyness. She compensated by becoming sharper, more impressive, more indispensable. Still, doubt crept in. It arrived not as regret, but as irritation and unnamed discomfort that surfaced when she realized no one truly knew her anymore. Not the way Daniel had. Not the way that felt dangerous only in hindsight. On the anniversary of the night she made him leave, Olivia poured herself a glass of wine and stood alone in the living room. She felt nothing dramatic, just a faint, inexplicable unease. Somewhere across the city, Daniel closed his laptop after a long day, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark for a moment before sleep. He did not think of Olivia, but the silence between them, carefully maintained, painfully earned, was already shaping the future neither of them could yet see. Time did not heal Daniel Moore. It reorganized him. 3 years after the night he was forced out of his own house, Daniel lived a life that would have looked unremarkable to anyone watching from a distance. A rented townhouse on the edge of Cambridge. A predictable morning routine. A small circle of professional contacts who knew him only by function, not history. Nothing about his existence invited curiosity, and that was intentional. He had learned that invisibility was not absence. It was control. Daniel no longer worked under his full name. In legal filings and advisory documents, he appeared as D. Moore, a consultant retained for difficult cases that required discretion more than publicity. His clients were institutions, not individuals, federal subcontractors, regulatory boards, private firms navigating legal gray zones where mistakes were expensive and silence was valuable. He was very good at what he did. The work drew on a former life he had once believed he'd buried permanently. High-level legal strategy, financial compliance, ethical risk mitigation. The intellectual rigor returned slowly at first, then all at once, like muscle memory reactivating after years of neglect. Daniel did not feel pride when solutions came easily. He felt steadiness, alignment. At night, he sometimes reviewed old notebooks, yellowed pages filled with annotations, arguments, counterarguments. He had kept them all these years without knowing why. Now he understood. They were evidence that the man Olivia had dismissed was not created by marriage and could not be destroyed by its end. He did not seek advancement. When colleagues suggested he publish, speak publicly, attach his name to high-profile outcomes, Daniel declined without explanation. Recognition implied narrative. Narrative invited scrutiny, and scrutiny threatened the quiet architecture he had built to survive. His apartment reflected that restraint. Neutral colors, clean lines, no photographs displayed, though a few were stored in a drawer him and Olivia once, smiling without irony. He did not look at them often. When he did, it was with detachment, like reviewing evidence from a closed case. Daniel did not date, not because he feared intimacy, but because he no longer trusted the language people used to describe it. Connection, chemistry, destiny. He had learned how easily those words justified erosion. Instead, he cultivated rituals. Morning runs along the Charles River before the city fully woke. Black coffee. News read without commentary. Work completed thoroughly without embellishment. Evenings spent reading or cooking meals that required patience. Things that could not be rushed without consequence. Occasionally, someone would ask about his past. He answered with partial truths. Divorced, no children, consulting for now. He never mentioned Olivia, not because her name still wounded him, but because speaking it felt like reopening a file that had already been resolved internally. There were moments, rare, unexpected, when grief resurfaced, not for the marriage itself, but for the version of himself that had believed sacrifice would be seen, understood, reciprocated. That man had not been weak, he had been sincere. Daniel mourned him quietly, then moved on. Across the city and upward, Olivia Moore lived a life increasingly defined by momentum. Her professional reputation had solidified into something formidable. She was known as decisive, adaptable, unburdened by sentiment. Clients trusted her to make difficult calls, executives valued her clarity. She was invited into rooms where power was exchanged without apology. Mark Ellison remained by her side, though his presence had changed. He was still impressive, still connected, but no longer attentive in the way he had been at the beginning. Olivia noticed how he checked his phone during conversations, how his compliments grew less specific. She compensated by becoming sharper, more accomplished, more indispensable. They shared an apartment downtown, sleek, expensive, temporary in feel. It never quite became theirs. Sometimes late at night, Olivia scrolled through social media, looking not for Daniel specifically, but for signs of permanence relationships that had lasted, faces that aged together. She told herself she was curious, not reflective. Daniel never appeared. His absence remained complete. No mutual acquaintances mentioned him. No professional overlap surfaced. It was as if he had slipped between layers of the city, existing in a parallel version of Boston that never intersected with hers. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Once after a difficult day, Olivia searched public records out of idle curiosity. Daniel's name surfaced in a handful of archived documents from years earlier. Nothing current, nothing revealing. She closed the tab with irritation. Still hiding, she thought. The assumption comforted her. Daniel, meanwhile, was reclaiming something far more dangerous than status. Agency. When a federal advisory committee quietly requested his expertise on a sensitive matter, involving ethical breaches at the highest levels, Daniel hesitated for the first time in years. The work would be consequential, invisible to the public, but influential in ways that shaped outcomes far beyond headlines. He accepted under one condition: no attribution. The committee agreed. The case consumed him for months, not obsessively, but thoroughly. Daniel approached it the way he now approached everything, with precision untainted by ego. His recommendations were surgical, his reasoning unassailable. When the matter concluded, policies shifted, careers were redirected, accountability occurred without spectacle. No one thanked him publicly. Daniel did not need them to. One evening after submitting the final memorandum, Daniel stood by his window as the city lights flickered on. He felt something unfamiliar, not joy, not vindication, but a quiet confirmation. He had not been erased. He had stepped aside. The distinction mattered. Elsewhere, Olivia raised a glass at a networking event, laughing easily, her confidence intact. Yet beneath the polished surface, a subtle fracture widened, an awareness that something essential had been lost long before she chose herself. She just didn't know what it was yet. And Daniel, moving deliberately through a world that no longer demanded explanation, continued forward unseen, uncelebrated, but increasingly impossible to undo. Olivia Moore learned how to stand in rooms where no one waited for her to speak. She had mastered the posture, shoulders relaxed, chin level, expression calibrated somewhere between confidence and restraint. In boardrooms overlooking the city, at charity galas lit with deliberate warmth, at private dinners where influence circulated like currency, Olivia moved with the ease of someone who belonged. Her name carried weight now. People listened when she spoke. They repeated her phrasing later, sometimes without realizing where it came from. Success, she discovered, had a sound. It was the hum of approval, the soft laughter that followed her remarks, the subtle nods exchanged when she entered a room. It was the invitations that arrived without effort, and the assumption always unspoken that she would say yes. Mark Ellison often stood beside her during these moments, hand resting lightly at the small of her back, his presence signaling alignment. To the outside world, they were cohesive, two ambitious people moving in parallel, reflective surfaces amplifying each other's prestige. But cohesion, Olivia was beginning to understand, was not the same as intimacy. Mark's attention had thinned in increments too small to confront directly. He still attended events, still introduced her proudly, but his mind often seemed elsewhere. He stepped away to take calls he did not explain. He arrived late, left early, filled absences with plausible reasons delivered smoothly. At first, Olivia dismissed it as momentum, the cost of ambition. She understood that language. She spoke it fluently. Yet something shifted the night she realized Mark no longer asked her questions. Not about her day, not about her thoughts, not even about her plans. He listened politely, but his responses were efficient, transactional. He mirrored her success without engaging its substance. It unsettled her more than overt neglect would have. At work, the pace intensified. Olivia was promoted again, placed in charge of accounts that required decisiveness bordering on ruthlessness. She delivered. Her reputation sharpened into something formidable, effective, unflinching, clear-eyed. She was praised for qualities that once might have been described less generously. She accepted the praise anyway. Public admiration, she learned, came with conditions. The same circles that elevated her expected consistency. Confidence could not waver. Vulnerability was tolerated only in curated doses, framed as narrative growth rather than unresolved doubt. Olivia adapted quickly, refining her public self into something seamless. But the cracks did not announce themselves loudly. They appeared in small moments of dissonance, a junior associate hesitating before responding to her, a client withdrawing warmth after a single miscalculated remark, an invitation that arrived later than expected or not at all. Olivia felt the shift acutely. Approval, once abundant, had become contingent. She worked harder. At home, the apartment remained immaculate, its surfaces reflecting success without offering comfort. Mark spent fewer nights there, citing travel, obligations, opportunities that could not wait. Olivia stopped asking for details. She did not want to appear insecure. She did not want to demand what should be given freely. Sometimes, alone in the quiet after midnight, she scrolled through her phone without purpose. Not looking for Daniel, she told herself that, but for reassurance that life, when properly managed, delivered permanence. Weddings, anniversaries, children framed by curated happiness. She observed them like artifacts from a civilization she had studied but never joined. Her own posts were impeccable. Professional achievements, elegant dinners, carefully angled photographs that suggested fulfillment without declaring it. The response was immediate likes, comments, validation delivered in predictable waves. And yet, when the phone dimmed and the room returned to silence, something inside her tightened. Mark noticed eventually. "You've been tense," he said one evening, loosening his tie as he scanned emails. "I'm busy," Olivia replied. "So am I." She waited for more. It didn't come. The distance between them expanded, not through conflict, but through omission. They avoided difficult conversations by remaining productive, successful, admired. It was easier that way. At a fundraising gala in Manhattan, Olivia was seated beside a woman she vaguely recognized, someone whose career had peaked years earlier, whose presence now felt nostalgic rather than commanding. "You've done well," the woman said, smiling with something that resembled admiration, but carried a trace of warning. "Just remember, it moves fast." "What does?" Olivia asked. "The moment you stop being useful." Olivia laughed politely, dismissing the comment as bitterness. Still, the words lingered. That night, Mark left early. "I'll catch up," he said, already halfway toward the exit. She watched him go without protest, without pursuit. Pride had become instinctual, necessary. The next morning, Olivia woke to an email from a client requesting reassurances, subtle ones, but unmistakable. Concerns had been raised. Not accusations, just questions. Olivia responded promptly, expertly, but the exchange unsettled her. She had built her assent carefully, but the structure beneath it felt increasingly narrow. For the first time in years, she thought of Daniel not as absence, but as contrast. He had never needed rooms to affirm him. He had moved through life without urgency, without the constant negotiation of relevance. She had once mistaken that for weakness. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. The thought irritated her. Daniel was gone, removed, irrelevant. She returned her focus to the present, to the calls, the meetings, the measured confidence that had carried her this far. She did not allow herself to linger on doubt. Doubt was indulgent. Doubt was dangerous. And yet, as applause followed her remarks at another event, Olivia felt a strange detachment, as if she were observing herself from a distance, aware that admiration, once secured, required constant renewal. Mark texted her later that evening, "Running late. Don't wait up." She didn't respond. Instead, Olivia poured herself a glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the city move below, brilliant, indifferent, unforgiving. For the first time, the question surfaced uninvited. What happens when this stops working? Somewhere across the city, Daniel Moore closed a file marked complete and powered down his computer. His life did not demand applause. It did not require constant proof. The distance between them was no longer just physical. It was philosophical. And Olivia, standing alone in a room designed to impress, felt the first unmistakable fracture run through the version of herself she had worked so hard to maintain. The collapse did not arrive as catastrophe. It began as an administrative inconvenience. An email marked confidential, copied to one person too many, a request for clarification that carried an unfamiliar tone, a meeting rescheduled twice before being quietly downgraded from strategic review to internal assessment. Olivia noticed these shifts immediately. She had trained herself to read the subtext of professional language with surgical precision. Something had changed. At first, she assumed it was temporary market volatility, internal politics, the usual turbulence that followed rapid ascent. She responded the way she always did, decisively, efficiently, without visible concern. She sent follow-up memos, scheduled calls, offered solutions before problems were fully articulated. The response was polite. It was also distant. Within weeks, distance hardened into restraint. A major client paused their engagement pending review. Another requested a change in representation, citing strategic realignment. The phrases repeated themselves often enough to form a pattern. Olivia's calendar, once densely packed, developed empty spaces that felt louder than meetings ever had. Mark Ellison noticed before she did. "You're being discussed," he said one evening, not unkindly, but with the detached curiosity of someone accustomed to shifting alliances. "Discussed how?" Olivia asked, carefully. She searched his face for reassurance and found none. The affair, which had once felt like momentum, now revealed its fragility. Mark's presence grew intermittent. When he was there, his attention wandered. He no longer shielded her from industry gossip. He merely acknowledged it. "You'll land on your feet," he said once, as if it were a foregone conclusion. The comment unsettled her more than open criticism would have. At work, the unspoken became undeniable. A compliance review uncovered irregularities, not criminal, not catastrophic, but enough to warrant scrutiny. Decisions Olivia had made under pressure were recontextualized by those eager to distance themselves. Colleagues who had once mirrored her language now spoke around her, careful not to align too closely. Public admiration turned conditional. The narrative shifted subtly, then abruptly. Olivia was no longer formidable. She was aggressive, no longer decisive, but reckless. Traits once celebrated were reclassified as liabilities when her position weakened. She understood the mechanism intellectually. She had participated in it herself. Still, the speed was disorienting. The first article appeared quietly, an industry blog, noting leadership concerns at her firm. No names at first, just implications. Within days, her name circulated in comments, then in follow-up pieces. Speculation multiplied faster than facts. Olivia watched her professional identity fragment in real time. Each headline a revision she did not authorize. Mark stopped coming home altogether. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. "This isn't what I signed up for," he said, already disengaged. "I need stability." The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. "You knew who I was," Olivia replied. "I knew who you appeared to be," he said. "That's different." He left without ceremony. No argument. No attempt at reconciliation. He packed his things with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the exit mentally long before executing it. Alone in the apartment, Olivia felt something crack open, not heartbreak, something colder. Security had been an assumption, a constant. She had believed herself insulated by competence, by relevance, by the careful cultivation of desire. Watching it unravel so quickly forced a reckoning she had avoided for years. She reached out to friends. Some responded with sympathy, carefully measured to avoid implication. Others did not respond at all. Invitations ceased. Conversation shortened. Olivia learned with startling clarity the difference between proximity and loyalty. The firm placed her on leave. Temporary, they said. procedural. She understood what it meant. Her name, once an asset, had become a liability too expensive to defend. At night, Olivia sat in the apartment she could no longer afford to romanticize. The silence was no longer curated. It was absolute. She poured wine she barely tasted, scrolling through messages that no longer arrived. In moments of exhaustion, her thoughts returned unbidden, unwelcome to Daniel. Not as memory, but as metric. He had left with nothing, no allies, no reputation to protect. She had assumed he would fail loudly or vanish permanently. Instead, he had vanished completely, leaving behind no evidence of collapse. The contrast was unbearable. One evening, while sorting through documents for the impending separation of assets she no longer shared with anyone, Olivia found an old file archived emails from years earlier. Correspondence Daniel had never discussed. Messages that hinted at opportunities, influence, a trajectory he had abandoned without explanation. Her chest tightened. She dismissed the feeling as fatigue. But the question had taken root. Who had Daniel really been? The collapse continued without regard for her introspection. Her leave became indefinite. The apartment went on the market. Her phone, once an extension of her authority, lay silent for hours at a time. For the first time since she had chosen herself, Olivia faced a truth she could not reframe. Nothing she had built was permanent, and the cost of discovering that truth so late, so publicly, was far higher than she had anticipated. Somewhere, Daniel Moore reviewed a briefing that referenced a recent industry scandal. He recognized the language immediately, the subtle distancing, the strategic silence. He closed the file without comment. The world he had stepped away from continued its rituals. This time, it was not his life unraveling. The discovery did not come with revelation or confrontation. It arrived the way most irreversible truths do, quietly, almost accidentally, disguised as coincidence. Olivia Moore was no longer meant to be at the downtown law center that afternoon. Her name had been removed from the panel weeks earlier. Her participation rendered unnecessary by circumstances no one felt compelled to explain in detail. Still, habit drew her there. Routine, even stripped of purpose, had a gravitational pull. She moved through the lobby unnoticed. That more than anything unsettled her. Once her presence had caused subtle shifts, heads turning, conversations pausing, recognition flickering across faces trained to assess value instantly. Now she passed through glass doors like anyone else, unremarkable, unregistered. She was halfway to the exit when she heard his voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Daniel. She stopped without turning around, her breath catching mid-inhale. Years had passed since she last heard him speak, but recognition was immediate, visceral. Some memories embedded themselves too deeply to be eroded by time. He stood several feet away, speaking to a small group near the elevators. His posture was unchanged, contained, deliberate, but everything else felt subtly recalibrated. The man before her carried no visible urgency, no performative confidence. His presence was unassuming, yet anchored. One of the men addressed him with unmistakable respect. "We'll defer to Moore's recommendation," he said. "He's handled matters at this level before." At this level. The phrase landed heavily. Olivia turned slowly. Daniel did not see her at first. He was focused on the conversation, his expression composed, attentive. There was no trace of bitterness on his face, no residue of the man she had expelled. Whatever life he had built since leaving her house had not bent him into something brittle. He looked intact. When his gaze finally lifted and met hers, the moment held. Recognition passed between them, not explosive, not dramatic, but profoundly destabilizing. Daniel's expression shifted only slightly, registering surprise before settling back into neutrality. No smile, no tension, just acknowledgement. "Olivia," he said politely. Her name sounded different in his voice now, detached, unburdened. "Daniel," she replied, the syllables unsteady despite her effort to control them. The others glanced between them, sensing history without understanding it. One excused himself. Another checked his phone. Within seconds, they had drifted away, leaving the two of them standing in a pocket of space that felt suddenly exposed. "I didn't know you were," Olivia began, then stopped. She didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Here?" Successful? Respected? Still relevant? I'm consulting, Daniel said simply. For them? She gestured vaguely, already aware of how inadequate the question sounded. For whoever needs discretion, he replied. Something tightened in her chest. They moved to a quieter corner of the lobby without discussing it, drawn by mutual instinct rather than intention. Up close, Olivia noticed details she hadn't expected, the calm in his eyes, the absence of defensive tension, the way he occupied space without apology. You disappeared, she said. Yes, you never. She stopped again. Accusation felt inappropriate. No one heard from you. That was deliberate. The clarity of his response disarmed her. A silence settled between them, not hostile, but weighted. Olivia realized with an unfamiliar sense of disorientation that she had no narrative prepared for this version of Daniel. He did not fit the assumptions she had built to justify her choices. What are you really doing, Daniel? She asked quietly. He studied her for a moment, not critically, not with judgment, but with the detached assessment of someone deciding how much truth a situation required. I returned to what I stepped away from, he said. The work I used to do. The words struck her harder than she expected. You told me you left that behind, she said. You said it wasn't worth the cost. I said I wasn't willing to pay it anymore, Daniel corrected gently. At the time, the implication was unmistakable. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, Olivia searched again. This time she knew where to look. Not social media, not press releases, institutional archives, advisory committees, legal memoranda buried beneath layers of formal language. She followed trails she had once navigated effortlessly, now with a desperation that bordered on panic. And there he was, not loudly, not prominently, but undeniably. Daniel Moore's fingerprints were everywhere. Policy shifts, ethical frameworks, strategic interventions that had shaped outcomes without ever attaching his name publicly. He had not rebuilt himself from nothing. He had re-entered a world he once commanded. She found older records too, opportunities he had declined, positions he had quietly vacated, correspondence time-stamped years before their marriage fracture, evidence of a life he had consciously diminished. For her, the realization was not cinematic. There was no single moment of collapse. Instead, understanding accumulated slowly, unbearably. Daniel had not failed after she expelled him. He had simply stopped protecting her from the truth of who he was. Olivia sat on the floor long after midnight, surrounded by documents she could not unsee. Her success, once framed as ascension, now felt precariously constructed atop a sacrifice she had never acknowledged, never even noticed. The silence she had interpreted as weakness revealed itself as restraint. The man she had dismissed had chosen obscurity not because he lacked ambition, but because he had loved her enough to believe a smaller life would be safer for them both. She covered her face with her hands, a sound escaping her that had no name. Across the city, Daniel closed his laptop after a long day and poured himself a glass of water. The encounter had registered, but it did not linger. His life no longer required recontextualization. He had already done that work. For Olivia, however, the past had shifted irrevocably, and the truth arriving so late, so calmly, offered no relief, only reckoning. They met again on a Sunday afternoon when the city was quieter than usual. Daniel chose the place without ceremony, a small cafe near the river, unremarkable, almost deliberately forgettable. Olivia arrived early, something she had not done in years. She sat by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she did not drink, watching pedestrians pass with the distant focus of someone waiting for an outcome they could not influence. When Daniel walked in, she recognized his presence before she saw him. He looked the same as he had days earlier at the law center, composed, contained, unaffected by anticipation. There was no hesitation in his movement, no emotional preamble. He spotted her, nodded once, and joined her at the table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Olivia said. He inclined his head. "You asked." That was true. She had sent a message careful, restrained, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for demand. He had replied hours later with a time and place. Nothing more. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not awkward. It was heavy with everything that had gone unspoken for years, layered so densely that it felt structural. "You look well," Olivia said finally. Daniel met her gaze. "So do you." It was a courtesy, not an assessment. She exhaled slowly. "I didn't know. About you. About what you gave up." "I never told you," he replied evenly. "So you couldn't have known." The absence of accusation unsettled her more than anger would have. She had rehearsed apologies in her mind, phrases weighted with remorse, explanations polished into coherence. Daniel's tone rendered them all unnecessary, almost irrelevant. "I thought you were hiding," she said. "After everything, I thought that I was ashamed," he finished for her, "that I couldn't recover." She nodded. "I was," Daniel said, "just not in the way you assumed." He took a sip of his coffee, unhurried. "I was ashamed that I had convinced myself love required reduction, that I had made myself smaller and called it compromise." Olivia felt the words settle into her chest, not as indictment, but as fact. "You never complained," she said softly. "I didn't want you to feel responsible," he replied. "I thought if I absorbed the cost quietly, we would both be protected." And instead, her voice wavered despite her effort. Instead, Daniel said, "I taught you to underestimate me." The statement was not resentful, it was observational. Outside, a jogger passed, the rhythm of his steps steady, indifferent to the conversation unfolding inside the cafe. Life, Daniel seemed to embody, did not pause for reckoning. "I made terrible choices," Olivia said. "I know that now." "I know," he replied. The simplicity of his response startled her. "You're not angry," she said. "I was," Daniel admitted, "for a long time. But anger has a half-life. It decays if you don't keep feeding it." She swallowed. "And now?" "Now I understand," he said, "that what you did was not about betrayal. It was about alignment. You chose a life that rewarded visibility. I chose one that valued integrity without audience." "That sounds like forgiveness," Olivia said cautiously. Daniel considered her for a moment. "No," he said. "It's clarity." The distinction landed with quiet finality. She leaned forward slightly, as if proximity might change the outcome. "If you had told me, if I had known you, still would have chosen yourself," he interrupted gently. "And that's not a criticism. It's a pattern." Her eyes filled, though no tears fell. "I lost everything," she said. "My work. Mark. The future I thought I was building." Daniel listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded once. "I'm sorry," he said. "Truly." The sincerity in his voice undid her. "Is there?" She stopped. The question she wanted to ask felt dangerous. "Is there any part of you that wishes we had another chance?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked out the window, watching the river move with indifferent patience. When he spoke again, his voice was steady. "No," he said, "because I would have to become someone else to make that possible. And I won't do that again." The truth surfaced without fury, without spectacle, without cruelty. It was devastating precisely because of its calm. They sat together for a few more minutes, speaking of inconsequential things, the weather, mutual acquaintances whose names no longer carried weight. When the conversation reached its natural end, Daniel stood. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said. She nodded, unable to speak. As he walked away, Olivia felt the full weight of the moment settle not as loss, but as recognition. The man she had expelled had returned not to reclaim her, but to release himself fully from the past. And she understood, with aching clarity, that some reunions exist not to mend what was broken, but to confirm that it cannot be restored. The weeks after the reunion passed without incident. No messages, no late-night confessions, no unexpected encounters engineered by nostalgia or regret. Daniel Moore returned to his routines with the same discipline he had cultivated for years, as if the meeting by the river had been a footnote rather than a turning point. He filed it away mentally, not erased, but resolved. That was the difference now. His life no longer required emotional negotiations with the past. Daniel's work continued in quiet succession. Briefings submitted, recommendations accepted without attribution, outcomes adjusted in rooms he would never enter again, once his role concluded. He remained invisible by design, a presence felt only through consequence. On one evening in early autumn, he received an offer, formal this time, unavoidable. A senior advisory role, long-term, with influence that could no longer remain entirely unseen. The proposal came with recognition, with a name attached, with public accountability. Daniel read it carefully. He did not think of Olivia when he declined. He thought of the man he had been when he believed love required self-erasure. He thought of the silence he had mistaken for peace. He chose, again, deliberately. Elsewhere, Olivia Moore learned what stillness felt like. The apartment was gone. The firm had moved on without ceremony. Her name, once circulated with admiration, now surfaced only occasionally, referenced in past tense, stripped of urgency. She had accepted consulting work beneath her former level, the kind that did not invite scrutiny but offered little validation. For the first time in her adult life, she was not watched. The anonymity unsettled her more than failure ever had. She spent mornings walking through neighborhoods she had once driven past without noticing. She cooked meals for herself, discovering the quiet ritual of preparation without audience. She read books she had previously displayed rather than absorbed. Sometimes she thought of Daniel, not with longing, with recognition. She understood now that the greatest cost of her choices had not been public collapse, but private misjudgment. She had mistaken restraint for lack of ambition, silence for absence, devotion for predictability. The door she had closed that night years ago had not merely shut him out. It had closed off a version of herself capable of seeing beyond immediate reward. One afternoon, while sorting through the last of her belongings, Olivia found an envelope she did not remember keeping. Inside was a note Daniel had written years earlier, never sent, never finished. A fragment of thought captured in his precise handwriting. I don't need to be seen as long as we are safe. She sat on the floor for a long time, the paper resting in her lap. The sentence did not accuse. It did not absolve. It simply existed, an artifact of a belief system she no longer inhabited. There was no impulse to reach out to him again. The reunion had been sufficient, more than sufficient. It had stripped away illusion without offering consolation, and that was its purpose. Understanding, she realized, was not the same as redemption. Some knowledge arrived too late to change outcomes. Months later, Olivia attended a small industry gathering, not as a figure of authority, but as a participant without title. No one asked her opinion first. No one deferred. The absence of expectation was oddly liberating. She left early, walking home through streets illuminated by winter light. For the first time, she did not feel compelled to measure her progress against anyone else's. Daniel, in his apartment overlooking the west-facing windows, watched the same season change. He allowed himself small, precise joys, a well-cooked meal, a long run, the satisfaction of work done cleanly. He did not romanticize solitude, but he respected it. It had given him back his proportions. One evening, as the city settled into quiet, Daniel considered the possibility of connection again, not as replacement, not as repair, but as addition. The thought did not frighten him. That, he knew, meant he was ready. Olivia, standing alone in her smaller kitchen, turned off the light and accepted a different truth. There are doors that close, not because of cruelty, but because they have served their purpose. Some lives cannot be reclaimed. Some loves are not meant to be repaired. And some endings, unadorned, uncelebrated, are the only honest resolution available. The city moved on, so did they, not together, but whole.